Sucrose and high fructose corn syrup are almost identical. Sucrose is one glucose, 6-membered ring, one fructose, 5-membered ring, the sweet one, bound together. High fructose corn syrup is one molecule of glucose, one molecule of fructose, not bound together. That's it. That's the difference. One's bound, one's not bound together. The enzyme in your intestines, sucrase, cleaves that bond for sucrose in about a nanosecond. You absorb the two molecules equally. So they do the same things. And all of the studies that pit sucrose against high fructose corn syrup are show no metabolic difference. I agree. They're both equally bad. The only difference is expense, because high fructose corn syrup is 1/3 the price of sucrose. And so that's how it got into all of your cookies, all of your chewy cookies. Remember when Chips Ahoy used to crumble and now they don't? That's high fructose corn syrup, because sucrose crystallizes and changes the composition of the cookie as opposed to high fructose corn syrup, which keeps it chewy. That's it. Other than that, they're the same. The fructose molecule is the sweet molecule. Glucose isn't particularly sweet. Anybody chug molasses? That's glucose. Okay? It's a little sweet, but not very, and it's not particularly pleasant. That's glucose. So when we're talking about sugar, we're talking about any fructose-containing compound, because that's the sweet one and that's the addictive one. That's the one that causes the nucleus accumbens to activate. That's the one that releases the dopamine. And it has been shown that when you give people glucose, it activates certain parts of the brain, but not the nucleus accumbens. And when you give fructose to people, it only activates the nucleus accumbens. So these two molecules are having two different effects on different parts of your brain. Now, glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. Called gluconeogenesis, happens in your liver. Protein or fats will break down both via the bloodstream to the liver, and the liver will turn that into glucose and then export it out to keep your blood glucose normal. So people who've never seen a carbohydrate, like the Inuit, Eskimos, they had no place to grow a carbohydrate. They ate whale blubber. Okay? They still had a serum glucose level. It was low, but it was still there, even though they didn't consume any, because their body made it. It's an adaptation for when you're a hunter, as opposed to a gatherer, the whole evolutionary thing. So, glucose is essential for life, but it is not essential to eat. Fructose is not only not essential for life, not only not essential to eat, but in fact is irrelevant. There is no biochemical reaction in the body that requires dietary fructose. It is completely vestigial. In fact, evolutionary biologists postulate that it is the reason that plants didn't develop brains and we did, is because we turned away from fructose as an energy source and toward glucose. Because glucose is found on the surface of neurons, fructose is not. The metabolism of fructose in the liver is exactly the same as the metabolism of alcohol. So it shouldn't be surprising that children now get the diseases of alcohol without alcohol. Type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease are two diseases that prior to 1980 were only seen with alcohol. Now children get it because they're consuming the equivalent of alcohol. The only difference between fructose and alcohol is that for alcohol, the yeast does the first step in metabolism. For fructose, we do our own first step. But after that, liver doesn't care where it came from. And obviously, alcohol has effects on the brain, which fructose does not. So alcohol has effects on the whole cerebral cortex, the hangover, and also the nucleus accumbens, the happy part, I shouldn't say happy, the pleasure part. And fructose only does the pleasure part. That's the difference. Other than that, the chronic effects of both are exactly the same. We should look to alcohol control policies to see what would work for sugar. And our group at UCSF, the Institute for Health Policy Studies, has actually published several papers on what worked for alcohol and how we could make that work for sugar. The problem is that the food companies are not acting like alcohol companies, they're acting like tobacco companies. And they're actually, burying the evidence, which they've been doing for 50 years.
Could you say a word about fruit?
Yeah, so fruit has fructose, right? But fruit also has fiber, lots of it. In fact, the amount of sugar is offset by the amount of fiber. If you did a scattergram of all fruits, sugar level, fiber level, it's almost like a diagonal straight line. So however much sugar there is, there's way more fiber, except for grapes. They're little bags of sugar. After that, they stay on the line. So why does fiber matter? The answer is fiber is the nutrient you don't absorb. Everyone thinks fiber is just, like what you throw in the garbage after you've juiced the fruit. Or fiber is the stuff that goes out in your poop and makes you regular. No, fiber has a very specific metabolic purpose. There are two kinds of fiber. You need both, soluble and insoluble. So insoluble fibers like cellulose, the stuff, stringy stuff in celery, and soluble fibers like pectins, like what holds jelly together. You put the two together and what happens is the insoluble fiber forms a lattice work, kind of like a strainer. And the soluble fiber plugs the holes in that lattice work, like Vaseline on a strainer. And now you have an impenetrable barrier that won't allow nutrients across the early part of the intestine. And what that means is that instead of the food going into the duodenum and getting absorbed right away from processed food, which then hits your liver and causes the liver fat and causes all the chronic disease that we talk about, it doesn't get absorbed because of that gel on the inside of the intestine that the fiber made. And so you will only absorb a small fraction of what you consumed. So what happens to the rest? Well, it keeps moving down the intestine. And what's in the second part of the intestine that's not in the first part? The bacteria, the microbiome. And so the microbiome, bacteria will chew up that sugar for its own purposes to stay alive. Remember, each of you has 10 trillion cells in your body, but you have 100 trillion bacteria in your intestine. They outnumber you 10 to 1. Now they got to eat something to stay alive. Well, what do they eat? They eat what you eat. The question is, how much did you get versus how much did they get? So when you consume the fruit, you consume the fiber to make sure they got the sugar. And it protected your liver in the process. So fruit is good, juice is not. So everybody who bought their Vitamix and Breville, throw it away. Or sell it on eBay to an unsuspecting consumer.
Okay, let's turn it open for discussion.
What about Sweeteners, Splendor, and all of those other?
Right. Everybody wants to know. Me too. I want to know too. It's not that I don't know, it's that nobody knows. Now, the question is, why don't we know? They've been around for a long time, right? 3 reasons we don't know. 3 reasons to be concerned. First reason, there's something called pharmacokinetics, there's something called pharmacodynamics. They're not the same. Pharmacokinetics is what your body does to a drug. Pharmacodynamics is what a drug does to your body. We have all of the pharmacokinetics for all the diet sweeteners because the FDA demands it. It's in their charter, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938. And pharmacokinetics tells you about acute toxicity, whether you keel over and die, like sarin or ricin or cyanide. We know those are acute poisons. And the FDA is charged with preventing acute poisons from entering the food supply. But chronic toxicity, long-term, what we're talking about, that's what pharmacodynamics tells you about. And we don't have any of that because the FDA does not ask for it. It's not in their charter. So the food industry goes, well, compounds on the market, can't help our sales. These are expensive studies that take thousands of people and years to do. No one's asking for it. We won't do it. And then the NIH says, hey, food industry's compound, food industry's profit. We're not going to pay for it. So we got an FDA doesn't ask for it. We got a food industry who won't do it. We got an NIH who won't pay for it. That's only problem number 1. Problem number 2, you put something sweet on the tongue. Message goes tongue to brain, sugar's coming. Message goes brain to pancreas, through the vagus nerve. Sugar bolus is coming, get ready to release the insulin. But then the sugar bolus never comes because it was a diet sweetener. What does the pancreas do? Does it go, oh man, I was waiting for that. I guess I'll just wait till tomorrow. Or does it go, you know, I got all these insulin vesicles sitting here in the pancreas, ready to explode. I'm gonna go find me some calories to work on. And you end up overeating because your insulin response was greater. Which one is it? Well, we have 3 papers now that address this question, at least on a daily basis. And they all 3 say the pancreas releases more insulin. Well, if the pancreas releases more insulin, then you're going to drive more of what you ate into fat cells. And you're also going to drive more chronic metabolic disease, irrespective and unrelated to the calories. The problem is we don't have chronic data on that. We only have acute data. We don't have one-day data. We don't have 6-month or 1-year data. We need that. And then the third problem with that issue is one paper out of Weizmann Institute in Israel from Elenov's group, where they gave diet sweeteners to rats and showed that it changed the microbiome and altered gut permeability and led to glucose intolerance. Now, if that were true in humans, then type 2 diabetes could occur from diet sweeteners all by itself. We just don't know if that's true yet. But that's a reason to be concerned. So in public, can I say that diet sweeteners are bad? No, because the science is not there yet to be able to make that claim. But am I worried about that possibility? Yeah, I'm worried about it.
Dr. Lustig, could you address how what we saw in Parkland with guns can be processed, so to speak, by your feces?
Yeah. People who like their guns really like their guns. They like them a whole lot. And the question is, why do they like them a whole lot? We don't have the data. We don't have the scientific data. And so I'm very careful about what I say. But the only thing I know is they really like them. I can assume that there's a dopamine response involved, but I can't prove it because there's no neuroimaging data that says so. So I have to be very, shall we say, careful.
It would seem that gun buyers would escalate caliber, bang factor, just like Medic wants more and more and more and more and more and more.
Well,
and even a shooting could be at the other end of the addiction cycle.
That's probably true, but again, without real science, it's hard for me to say. What I can say is that the average gun owner owns 3 guns. That's the average. But if you look at the display on that, it's enormous, absolutely enormous. The distribution is very kurtotic. So what that suggests is that there is a group of buyers in whom no amount of guns is enough. That's what that would suggest. And the question is that related to dopamine? And, and this issue of tolerance and dependence that we've talked about. And the answer is, I don't know.
Where do we go to find our information so we can make the right choices about our next cereal or?
All right, well, first of all, if you're choosing cereal, you've already made a wrong choice. Okay. Cereal was an invention of John Harvey Kellogg because he thought that protein caused constipation. So he developed a non-protein food source that basically was, refined carbohydrate. And then his brother figured out how to scale it up. And so Kellogg's was born. There's plenty of data that says that that ain't so. So anybody who's eating cereal is already, behind the 8 ball. And that includes you.
That
in
kind
terms
of cereal. But
sorry?
We're not talking about oatmeal or.
So steel cut oats, has the fiber. So it's not refined. That's the point. Is if you eat non-refined carbohydrate, it's okay. It's safe carbohydrate. This actually goes to Jeffrey's question, which I didn't answer, about glycemic index and glycemic load. So anybody familiar with these 2 terms? They're not the same, but they're used interchangeably, and it matters. Glycemic index is a number ascribed to a food, which is 100 or less. And what it is it's how high does your blood glucose rise when you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in a certain food relative to 50 grams of white bread. So if a food has the same final glucose level as white bread, it would have a glycemic index of 100. If the glucose stayed baseline, it would have a glycemic index of 0. Now, who here likes carrots? Yeah, I like carrots. Carrots are good. Now, if you look at the glycemic index of carrots, it's 96. You would say, that's bad. It means that blood glucose goes up. Now, the problem with the blood glucose going up that high is that means your insulin goes up too. And it's the insulin that's causing both the energy storage in fat, the weight gain, and also the chronic metabolic disease. So you want to keep your insulin response as low as possible. That's the goal of all of this, is to try to reduce your insulin, keep the insulin down. Carrots have a glycemic index of 96, because if you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in carrots, your blood sugar will go up pretty high. But glycemic load is a different question. What glycemic load asks is, how many carrots do you have to eat to get to 50 grams? And the answer for carrots is 700 grams of carrots, 1.4 pounds of carrots. You have to eat the whole friggin' Grimway truck. Now, do you know anybody who eats 1.4 pounds of carrots in a day, never mind a sitting, other than Bugs Bunny? Okay? No one does it. And the reason they don't do it is because of the fiber. Carrots are all fiber. That's why they're so hard to cut through when they're raw, is because of the fiber. So you can't do it. You can't even eat 1.4 pounds of carrots. Glycemic load is the thing you really care about. But glycemic load is complicated and hard to compute, and people don't understand it. So they do this glycemic index, and it's really irrelevant. Another example of how bad this issue is sugar. So sugar is half glucose, half fructose, right? So when you absorb 50 grams of sugar, your blood glucose isn't going to go as high as if you consumed 50 grams of molasses, because molasses is all glucose, whereas sugar is half glucose, half fructose. So the peak won't be as high because it's only half as much. Sugar has a low glycemic index. In fact, the agave industry has made a fortune out of saying that agave is 75% fructose, low glycemic index, good for diabetics. Garbage. Total, complete, utter trash. And I'm calling them out right now. The reason is, yeah, your blood glucose won't go as high, so yeah, it's got a low glycemic index. What it will do is make your blood fructose go high. And blood fructose is 7 times worse than glucose at causing the aging reaction in your arteries, in your liver, in your nerves, and turns out your pancreas has so fructose is way worse than glucose, yet it's not captured in the glycemic index. It would be captured in glycemic load, because fruit is low glycemic load because it has all that fiber. So glycemic load works. You want to do glycemic load? Fine.
So if you just have pure fructose intake, the glycemic load
Was zero.
zero.
Zero. It's not going to change your blood glucose.
But you get an insulin spike.
Sorry?
But you have an
But
insulin.
you'll get an insulin spike.
Right, but you will not have a glycemic load
No.
measure. So the glycemic load, to the extent that it's helpful, is just as a marker for
Insulin.
glucose coming together with fructose.
Right, that's right. That's right. So they don't want you to know that, because if you knew that, you would change what you ate probably significantly.
Henry?
Henry Greenberg. In another area, global trade agreements have struck me as being disastrous for most of the participants. And while it's touted as being a, quote, good thing, the Trans-Pacific Partnership had just dreadful health components in it. And what I was struck by is that there was absolutely no comment by any American public health professional on the health aspects of that agreement. In fact, when I wrote a paper on it with one of our students who had an NPH, she turns out to be the only public health professional who up until a year or two ago had commented all on this. And that agreement is considered to be the precursor of models going forward that we will be engaging in ad infinitum. And I wonder if you would comment on that in terms of making your arguments global.
Well, I'm actually going to defer to Jeffrey on this because I actually don't know what was in the Trans-Pacific Partnership to be able to speak to it in any meaningful way. I wouldn't be surprised that it was, from a public health standpoint, not a good thing. And the reason for that is because processed food's cheap, and it's something that everyone wants to sell, and it's something that everyone wants to purchase, so it probably made allowances for that, but I don't know that. I'll give you an example of something that I do know. Last week, President Trump unveiled his method for dealing with SNAP. It's going to be called America's Harvest Box. And it's going to be all pre-processed packaged food, none of which requires refrigeration. And the reason for that is obvious, because it's the cheapest form of calories available and will do the most damage. And that's clear. So I'll leave the TPP to Jeffrey, who probably knows way more about it.
Just a couple of points. One, just to continue on this question of cheap calories. That is a factor. Also the processing and the shelf life and so forth. I think the two strands of processing for the sake of low cost and also shelf life, and for the sake of addiction, are probably two related strands. One sells for economic reason, and one sells for the induced psychological response. And they're both part of the story. And they are part of a deeper story, which I would just add as a broader part of the meta story of all of this, which is we're trying to feed 7.6 billion people. That is per se hard on a healthy diet, of course, and it is easier on mass industrial monocultures. It's easier on processed grains that can be distributed widely. There is a scale problem that is unsolved. We can't even feed 7.6 billion people with this absolutely disastrous diet. We haven't proved. Nobody has proved yet exactly what the agricultural and other mix would be for a healthy diet and affordable as well. And it also comes to your slide on removing the food subsidies. It would be a little more complicated than that, because there would be a hit for people who have a large share of food in their consumption basket. And one would have to take the savings and do something to help to offset that. And what we see, of course, not only because of the subsidies, fruits and vegetables have gone up in relative price substantially compared to basic grains, even unprocessed. So this is the real economics of feeding a population that is orders of magnitude larger than our species normally would have before we took over the planet, is another aspect of this. But to come to the trade agreements, every chapter is like that, Henry.
I know.
Yeah, but not by accident. The whole legislation is written by corporate lobbies working together with the Obama administration and with any administration. Trump actually stopped this agreement, ironically. Obama, the good president, was the one that put this proposal forward. The public health and other public policy advocacy side wasn't even allowed to see these drafts. These were secret. Congressmen could not even have printed copies of these drafts. But those who did were all of the trade associations of the major industries. this is legislation designed to promote particular corporate interests, whether it's big pharma or the expansion of the American food industry and so on. So whatever horrible things are in there are not by oversight, they're by design.
Absolutely.
And also they've given trade a bad name, let me say, because trade agreements are not about trade primarily. Trade agreements are primarily about corporate policies that are not about trade barriers per se, but are about regulatory policies, are about intellectual property rights, the ability to control products, the flow of dangerous substances, and so on. And those are not trade policies. So I want to speak up for trade a little bit, but distinguish it strongly from trade agreements, which are corporate agreements.
My point was really that the American public health establishment has missed the issues that
Absolutely.
they could raise. And actually, if you go to the U.S. Trade Representative website, they list their advisory committees, and there's no public health person.
Absolutely.
But they say at the bottom, if you want to be on a committee or want to nominate someone, here's the phone number.
Right.
So public health doesn't pick up the phone.
You are on hold.
I didn't try the number.
Yeah, believe me. For the next 10 years. Yes.
You talk about how much sugar we have, sugar in almost everything. I always look. What is, how many grams of sugar should we have? I mean, and it's not going to be zero, but there's got to be an optimal number here.
Right. So, almost assuredly, everyone's different, so there's probably an optimal number that's different for everybody. However, based on the data that currently exist in terms of dose response and dose disease, we think, and I put that in big quotes, we think that the maximum threshold dose before you start seeing disease is 5% of calories, which would be the equivalent of about 25 grams, which would be about 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day total. At that level, you start seeing dental caries once you go above 5%. And the WHO in 2015 drafted an upper limit that had 5% as its max, which I was very happy to see and in favor of. However, then the industry went after it. And ultimately, the WHO was forced to amend that number to 10% of calories, which would be 12 teaspoons of added sugar. So today, and the USDA signed on to that number as well in 2016. So if you ask a government, they'll tell you 10% of calories, which would be 12 teaspoons per day, which would be about 200 calories per day. Okay, 10%. So 2,000 calorie diet, 200 calories as added sugar. I actually think that's too high. The American Heart Association, sorry?
So you're saying 5%?
Yeah, the American Heart Association said 7 to 8%, and I actually helped co-author that guideline back in 2009. But that was specifically for cardiovascular disease.
And what is the actual proportion?
So right now, it's at 17%. We have a long way to go. If you're quadruple and you only end up to 3.5 times as much, do you see much of an effect clinically? No. So I think that we have a tremendously difficult and problematic road ahead to try to get there.
What is the diet, or is it genetics that produces the TOFI phenomenon?
Oh, everybody wants to know. I mean, everybody
The
wants to
thin
know.
on the outside, fat on the inside. And Asians do it.
And Asians. We don't know why for Asians. We think we know why for Latinos. There are 2 polymorphisms of 2 genes that are involved in triglyceride metabolism in Latinos. And if you have those, a little sugar makes a lot of liver fat and a lot of metabolic syndrome, which is one of the reasons why Latinos are so prone to getting type 2 diabetes. We don't know that for Asians, but clearly Asians, especially South Asians, Indians, you had that New York Times 4-part series back in 2013 or 12, I can't remember, as to how severe the diabetes pandemic is, not just in New York City South Asians, but in Indian South Asians. They have an enormous diabetes prevalence, and they're not fat. And the Indian government knows this, and they know it's sugar, and they actually went to Indra Nooyi, President CEO of Pepsi, and said, you have to reformulate Pepsi-Cola, which is the Coca-Cola of India. Pepsi has the lion's share of the soft drink market in India. You have to reformulate Pepsi-Cola specifically for India because you're causing disease there. And I can show you the article from the Economic Times where they reported on this, that the Indian government actually petitioned Pepsi to change the formulation of Pepsi for India to stop diabetes.
Please.
No.
Bill Gates is spending most of the fortune that he gives out charitably on education and food distribution. Food distribution. Do we know who he accesses for food distribution? What I'm getting at here is, with all that money, if he were to become aware of what we're talking about here today, and the food that he would pay for would be health food rather. In other words, I don't know whether it's packaged food or whatever. But would he not be a viable resource for getting the word out? And he has enough power to somehow be on the anti-government, to change government. He can move. Money moves worlds. We know that. Do you know what I'm getting at?
He's not involved in food distribution. His main spending overwhelmingly is in public health and the polio campaign.
I thought I heard yesterday.
No, he's also involved in agriculture in Africa. That's different. So he's helping smallholder farmers on questions of soil or of crop variety and so on. It's relevant, of course, for diet, but it's not about food processing, and even less is it about food distribution. He's not doing that. And in the United States, not at all, basically. So he's not really part of this particular story. Salome.
I'm interested in your thoughts.
You guys speak up so everybody can hear.
I'm interested in your thoughts on antidepressants, I guess, particularly SSRIs, and what you think, how they affect your serotonin levels over time in general, and then do you think they're overprescribed and why?
Let's put it this way. Everyone's unhappy. And if you're unhappy, you'll do anything to get happy. Everyone says that happiness is the single most important thing in their lives. When you do indices, and ask this question of large populations, but we certainly don't act that way. There is no question that if you are clinically depressed, you need an SSRI. If you have endogenous clinical depression, you need an SSRI, or you will be likely suicidal. The question is, what about all of these just dysphoric, dysthymic, unhappy people? What's going on with them? Because that's the overwhelming majority of SSRI users. And the answer to that is no one's really sure. But probably a lot of that has to do with anxiety, more than it has to do with clinical depression per se. And one of the interesting phenomena that has come out about this has to do with the states in which marijuana's been legalized, now in California too. If you look at the 5 states in which marijuana's been legalized since their legalization, SSRI prescription use has fallen commensurate with the marijuana increase. So it looks like the marijuana is serving the purpose that the SSRI was. And most people consider marijuana to be an anti-anxiety agent because it binds to the endocannabinoid 1 receptor, which then puts some cells to rest. In fact, it's one of the reasons why it's stabilizes mood. So the question is, should everybody be on marijuana? I'm not suggesting that, but very clearly, we have a problem with mood regulation in this country that people are turning to substances to try to alleviate.
So marijuana is not a dopamine.
No, it's not a dopamine
excitatory.
agonist. It's not an excitatory. It's an endocannabinoid agonist. And for the most part, it puts neurons to rest in the same way serotonin puts neurons to rest. Slightly different neurons, but it's primarily functioning as an anti-anxiety agent. And that's probably what most people have. They just don't know what to call it.
Rob, I was contacted by NIAID, horrified at the marijuana deregulation, that it's the stepping stone to the other.
Well,
but
it might be.
Very different pathway, though.
It's a different pathway. It is a different pathway. However, there is concern. In particular, there's concern amongst its use in adolescents. And the reason is there's data that supports the argument that marijuana may be particularly problematic for the developing brain. And the correlational data, obviously it's hard to do causation here, but the correlational data says that chronic adolescent marijuana users have an 8-point IQ deficit. Now the question is, did they have that 8-point IQ deficit and that's why they wanted the marijuana? Or is it the, again, reverse or intermediate causality. These studies can't be done in humans. There are animal studies that do suggest that marijuana can have effects on the developing brain and can cause what it probably does is it causes delayed migration of certain neurons more than it does cause death in neurons. So it probably does have brain effects, it's just not killing the neurons.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Mark Ashton. I think that stat that you cited even applies to CBD.
CBD cannabidiol.
Right. They've been finding some relief, even though it's primarily pain usage, even for anxiety. Quick comment and a question, if I may. There's been research on prison populations, and when nutritionists reform the menu and so forth, that conduct within those walls is much less tense, even less violent.
Totally. Bernard Gesh in the UK took him 35 years to do this study in prisons, vulnerable population. He basically gave a multivitamin or placebo for 2 years to inmates in the UK and showed a 42% reduction in violent behavior and events in the population treated with the multivitamin. Suggesting, and he didn't change the food, he just gave them the multivitamin, suggesting that something about nutrition might actually have something to do with behavior. So I'm totally on board. I hear you.
And a quick question, to piggyback on that gentleman's question about alternate sweeteners. What about the so-called natural alternate sweeteners like lucuma, monk fruit, erythritol, allulose?
Right. So I know a little bit about monk fruit. I don't know much about the others. So I'll just tell you what I do know about monk fruit. There was a study that was done. I actually reviewed the paper, so it's right in my head. Last year, the first author was Tay, T-E-Y. It was in the, I forget which journal it was in. I think it was American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I could be wrong. What they did, which I thought was very interesting, they did it in Singapore. They took regular old people, nothing wrong with them, and they did 5 days of experimentation, like every week, so that and they did them in random order. They gave them, in the morning, they gave them a sucrose tolerance test, not glucose, but sucrose, so sugar. Looked at their insulin response for 2 hours. Then, and then on other days, so one day was sucrose for 2 hours, one day it was aspartame for 2 hours, one day it was sucralose for 2 hours, and one day it was monk fruit for 2 hours. Okay, and then they gave it to them, measured their blood glucose and insulin for the 2 hours. Then they gave them lunch and dinner. And they watched what happened over lunch and dinner. What happened was that the sucrose gave them a big response on glucose and insulin. The diet sweeteners did not during that 2 hours. But at lunchtime, the day of the sucrose, they ate less at lunch and less at dinner, and their insulin response was less because they ate less. Whereas on the days when they had the diet sweetener, their lunch and their dinner was more, and their insulin response was even higher. In other words, holding back on the effect when they had the diet sweetener, which then went later on. You know, again, this idea that I'm going to go find some calories to work on. And so the insulin area under the curve and the total number of calories were exactly the same, whether they consumed the sucrose in the morning or any of the diet sweeteners. So my best guess, based on that study, because that's all I know about monk fruit, is it probably doesn't matter. And before this is all the time, and I wasn't trying to diet, I was just eating food at home that we cooked, and I lost the 40 pounds, and my metabolic health got way better. So, I mean, I live it now.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Please.
Okay, thank you. I have 3 questions.
Maybe take one because we're coming to the last 5 minutes. So pick your best and we'll go around for 3 questions from the group.
Okay, so I'll make it my best one. You were talking about how people between the ages of people younger than 20 have their brains are not like completely developed. And you said how they do stupid things. Is that because they're more prone to release dopamine and less serotonin, or is it the other way around, as you said? It's not known?
That's a good question. We don't know.
Okay.
Okay, please.
Okay, just a quick remark regarding cereals. Another option beyond oats is to use wheat, grind it at night, or have it stone ground and soak it overnight. It's used in Europe.
Okay, please.
On the sugar addiction, as far as I know, it doesn't meet all of the criteria to diagnose it as an addiction, or like food addiction that hasn't been included in the DSM.
Right.
Yeah,
You're
so
absolutely right.
yeah.
Food addiction is not included in the DSM-5. Internet gaming disorder is not included in the DSM-5. It's in the appendix as requiring further study. You are absolutely correct. It has not been added to the DSM, but it is a big concern, and there are many psychiatrists who have written textbooks on food addiction. It meets the criteria for tolerance and dependence that the DSM-5 set up. Whether, it's like the old Yogi Berra, Mickey Cochran apocryphal story in the World Series. Berra was at the plate, Cochran was behind the plate, the Dodgers were in the field. Ball comes in, Berra holds, nothing from the umpire. Cochran turns around, says, "So what was it, a ball or a strike?" The umpire says, "Ain't nothing till I call it." So, I mean, if the
It's like quantum physics too.
Yeah, pretty much. So if the American Psychiatric Association all of a sudden said, yeah, there's this thing called food addiction, then everybody'd say there's food addiction. That doesn't make any of this any less important or relevant, just because the APA is being, shall we say, a little slow. Okay? They haven't even said internet gaming disorder, yet there are suicides and people dying in South Korea from internet gaming disorder. I mean, got to use your brain.
We'll take one more. Yes, you.
I was wondering about your thoughts on fasting, because intermittent fasting is a fashionable thing now or something.
Right. Someone
And
actually asked
general
that at the break.
fasting.
Someone asked the same question at the break. So the question is, why does intermittent fasting work? And the answer is that liver fat. Because if you intermittently fast, you give the liver a chance to burn off that liver fat, and that improves insulin sensitivity. The question is, why did the liver fat get there in the first place? So, if you're sick, intermittent fasting is a way to clear the liver fat to get better. But if you ate right, you wouldn't develop the liver fat in the first place, in which case you wouldn't need to intermittently fast.
But fasting in general, like you know how people don't eat for a couple of weeks.
And that's good.
They say they feel great.
Okay.
Health-wise.
I do it once a year on Yom Kippur, and I don't feel great.
Okay, please join me in a remarkable.